The ocean world of Elisara had never known a ruler like Princess Nyria, and not in any way its people considered a compliment. By the age of 6, she had failed her first etiquette examination by asking the instructor why bowing to the eastern tide shrines mattered more than bowing to the western ones, when the tides themselves paid no attention to compass points. By 12, she had failed a military strategy assessment by refusing to accept that the 60-year doctrine, a defensive formation unchanged since the Cryo Wars, was still the correct one, given that the Empire's enemies now had aircraft that made the doctrine's assumptions obsolete. By 17, she had failed so many diplomatic evaluations that the outer court had taken to calling her, behind cupped hands and closed doors, Nyria the Unready. The whispers followed her everywhere, the way the tide follows the moons of Elisara, patient, relentless, and impossible to outswim. She cannot even recite the litany of succession without pausing to ask what it means. One noble sniffed at a state dinner, unaware, or uncaring, that the princess sat 2 tables away. A queen doesn't need to understand the ceremony. She needs to perform it. They say her younger sister Illyra could recite the entire litany at 9, said another. Perhaps it's time the crown considered which daughter actually deserves it. Nyria heard these things the way she heard most things. Quietly, and without argument, filing them away behind a face that had long ago learned not to flinch. She was 19 years old, the eldest daughter of the Ocean Throne, and by every account the Empire could produce, she was a disaster waiting to be crowned. Her mother, Queen Solane, was not a cruel woman, but she was a tired one. 10,000 years of unbroken succession did not permit a monarch the luxury of leniency, and the queen had watched daughter after tutor after examiner walk away from Nyria shaking their heads. The Academy of the Six Tides had assigned her its finest scholars, masters of statecraft, war, ceremony, and lore, and each had returned the same verdict with different words: the princess cannot be taught. It was not strictly true. But no one on Elisara had yet found the right way to say what was actually happening. With the coronation 4 months away and every option exhausted, Queen Solane did something that would scandalize the 6 courts for a generation. She sent a private message through the diplomatic relay to a remote research and education station on the Empire's outer rim, requesting the placement of a single tutor, human, non-noble, non-scholar, to attempt what an empire of 8-limbed strategists and 100-year professors could not. The outer court called it desperation. History would call it the turning point. Ethan Carter had not set out to become a legend on an alien planet. He had set out, 12 years earlier, to be a decent history teacher at a public high school in Ohio, and for a while, that was exactly what he'd been. Patient with the kids other teachers wrote off, unglamorous, well-liked, and married to a woman named Claire who used to tease him for grading papers at the kitchen table until midnight. Claire had been gone 6 years now. Cancer did not care about lesson plans. After she passed, Ethan had done what a lot of grieving people do: he'd taken the first job that let him leave. It happened to be an educational post aboard the Corvallis Relay, a remote multi-species space station that served as neutral ground for the children of diplomats from a dozen different worlds. Humanity was a minor, unglamorous species in the wider galactic order, tolerated, occasionally useful, rarely respected. And Ethan Carter, a man with no advanced degrees and no particular ambition beyond doing right by whoever sat in his classroom, was about as unremarkable a representative as the species could offer. Which was, as it turned out, exactly why he was good at his job. He didn't chase the brilliant students. He went looking for the ones nobody else wanted. The alien boy who couldn't sit still, the diplomat's daughter who cried before every exam, the refugee kid who hadn't spoken a full sentence in 8 months. Ethan had a talent, quiet and unfashionable, for finding out why a kid was struggling instead of simply recording that they were. It rarely made him popular with the other instructors, who preferred tidy metrics. It made him beloved by exactly the kids who needed him. So when the message came through, a formal, slightly desperate offer from the Ocean Throne of Elisara, offering a fee that made his station supervisor whistle, Ethan almost said no. He was 51 years old. He liked his small apartment with the window that looked out on the stars. He did not, particularly, want to be a diplomatic experiment on a planet that had never had a human set foot on it. But the message included one detail that changed his mind. The princess has been examined by 41 instructors. Each believes she cannot learn. We do not believe this is correct, but we no longer know how to prove it. Ethan had read that line 3 times. He had heard those words before, not about a princess, but about a boy named Marcus in his 9th period class, 7 years ago, who every other teacher had marked as unteachable until Ethan discovered the kid wasn't failing to understand the material. He was failing to see the point of it, because no one had bothered to explain why it mattered. He remembered the meeting where 3 other teachers had recommended Marcus be moved down to remedial coursework, a meeting Claire had sat in on, back before she got sick, back when she still used to needle him afterward at the kitchen table about how worked up he got over other people's kids. "You're going to give yourself an ulcer over a system that isn't yours to fix," she told him that night, only half joking, watching him grade essays with more force than the pen required. "Maybe," he'd said. But nobody in that room asked him why he stopped trying. They just decided he couldn't. And you're going to ask him. Somebody has to. He had, the next day, kept Marcus after class not to lecture him but to ask, plainly, what part of the material actually made sense to him, and what part felt like noise. It turned out almost none of it was noise. Marcus understood orbital mechanics better than half the seniors in the advanced physics elective, purely from tinkering with flight simulators at home, but couldn't make himself care about memorizing dates for a history unit that never once explained why any of it had mattered to the people living through it. Ethan had spent the next 6 weeks rebuilding the unit around exactly that question, not what happened, but why anyone alive at the time thought it was worth doing. And watched a kid 3 teachers had already written off turn into the best student in the room. Marcus was an aerospace engineer now. He still sent a card every December, usually with a photograph of something he'd helped build. Claire had been gone before Marcus graduated. She never got to see it. Ethan had thought of her card, and the ulcer joke, and the particular ache of doing his best work in an empty house, more times than he could count in the years since. And he thought of it again now, alone in his small apartment on the Corvallis Relay, staring at a message from a planet he'd never heard of, describing a princess 41 scholars had already decided couldn't be taught. He knew, somehow, before he'd finished rereading the message a 4th time, that he wasn't going to say no. Ethan wrote back the same night, "I'll come." Elisara was, by any objective measure, one of the most beautiful worlds Ethan had ever seen from orbit. A marbled sapphire globe, 90% ocean, its landmasses a scattering of island continents linked by floating causeway cities that rose and fell with the tides like breathing lungs. The royal seat, Threnhollow, sat atop the tallest of these, its spires carved from pale coral stone that glowed faintly blue at dusk. It was, Ethan thought as the shuttle descended, the kind of place Claire would have wanted to paint. The reception he received on the ground was considerably less beautiful. "You're smaller than I expected," said the first official to greet him, an angular, silver-scaled Elisaran named Vorin Thess, headmaster of the Academy of the Six Tides. Vorin had 400 years of teaching experience, and the bearing of a man who had never once been told he was wrong. "Humans age quickly, do they not? You appear worn." "Grief does that," Ethan said mildly. "Nice to meet you too." Vorin did not smile. Elisarans rarely did with their mouths, their emotional cues carried instead in the faint bioluminescent patterns along their jaws, which currently pulsed a shade Ethan would later learn meant barely restrained contempt. "I want to be plain with you, Instructor Carter," Vorin said as they walked the long coral colonnade toward the palace's east wing. "You are the 42nd attempt to educate Princess Nyria." The other 41 included the Empire's foremost scholars in statecraft, warfare, theology, and history, beings with centuries of experience, and minds capable of holding the entirety of the Elisaran legal code in memory. If they could not succeed, I confess I do not see what a human schoolteacher believes he will accomplish. Probably nothing, Ethan said cheerfully. But I'd like to meet her before I decide that. Voron's jaw patterns flickered. Surprised this time, though he covered it quickly. You do not intend to defend your credentials? I don't have any that would impress you. I taught 10th grade history to bored teenagers for 22 years. My biggest achievement is that a few of them still send me birthday cards. Ethan shrugged. If that's not enough, you're welcome to send me home. But I'd like to actually meet her first, instead of just meeting her file. Voron said nothing to that. But something in the set of his shoulders shifted. Not respect, not yet, but perhaps the faintest willingness to wait and see. Nyria was not what Ethan expected. The file's Queen Solaine's staff had sent ahead painted a portrait of a listless, distracted girl, inattentive in lessons, disengaged in counsel, prone to long silences that her instructors had interpreted as either stupidity or insolence, depending on which report you read. What Ethan found, when he was shown into the small sunlit study where she sat with a stack of unopened texts before her, was a young woman who looked less like she didn't care, and more like she had simply stopped expecting anyone to listen. She was tall for her people, dark-scaled with faint patterns of blue-green along her collarbone that shifted, subtly, when she noticed him enter, a flicker Ethan couldn't yet read, but would later learn was wariness braced for disappointment. "You're the human," she said. Not a question. Ethan Carter. He didn't bow, didn't perform any of the elaborate greeting rituals Voron had spent 20 minutes drilling him on in the shuttle bay. He just pulled out the chair across from her, uninvited, and sat. "You're the princess who's supposedly impossible to teach. I've been told." Her tone was flat, guarded. "You'll last a week. Maybe 2. They always do, right up until they realize I'm not going to become someone else just because they've run out of patience. I'm not planning on making you become someone else." That's what the last one said too. Right before he told my mother I was wasting the crown's resources. She finally looked up at him properly, and Ethan saw something in her eyes he recognized immediately, because he'd seen it in 100 students before her. Not defiance, exactly, and not despair, but the specific, exhausted vigilance of someone who has learned that hope is the thing that gets punished hardest. "Ask me something," Ethan said. She blinked. "What?" "Anything. Doesn't matter what. I want to hear a question you got in trouble for asking." Nyria studied him for a long moment, clearly waiting for the trick to reveal itself. When it didn't, she said slowly, testing the words like a blade she expected to be taken from her. "During my last military assessment, I was asked to describe the correct formation for repelling a coastal incursion, according to the 60-year doctrine. I said the doctrine was written before the Kryl had aircraft, and that a formation designed entirely around naval and amphibious threats made no allowance for an aerial approach, and that if I were actually commanding troops during an incursion, following the doctrine exactly as written would probably get half of them killed. And I was marked wrong. Because the doctrine is sacred. Because it has protected Elisara for 600 years. Because questioning it is." She stopped herself, jaw tightening. "Is what?" "Disrespectful," she said quietly. "To the commanders who wrote it. To the soldiers who died trusting it. Everyone acted like I'd insulted the dead by pointing out the enemy had changed." Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then he said plainly, "You weren't wrong." Nyria's head came up sharply. "The doctrine protected Elisara for 600 years against threats that don't exist anymore in the same form." Ethan continued. "That doesn't make the doctrine sacred. It makes it outdated. A rule that saved lives once isn't automatically a rule that saves lives forever. The people who wrote it were smart enough to solve the problem in front of them. Your being smart enough to notice the problem in front of you is different. That's not disrespect. That's the same skill, applied honestly." For the first time since he'd walked into the room, Nyria didn't say anything at all. She just looked at him, and the faint blue-green patterns along her collarbone shifted again, and this time, Ethan was fairly sure, they meant something closer to disbelief. "You're supposed to tell me to memorize the doctrine anyway," she said finally. "That's what everyone tells me. Learn it, recite it, don't ask why. I'm not everyone." Ethan opened his bag and pulled out, of all things, a battered paperback copy of a book on ancient Roman military strategy, the kind of thing he used to hand out to bored sophomores. "I'm going to teach you the doctrine. All 600 years of it. But I'm also going to teach you why every part of it exists, who wrote it, what problem they were solving, and what happens when the problem changes and the solution doesn't. Because a ruler who understands why a rule exists can tell you when it's still protecting people, and when it's just protecting itself." Nyria stared at the book, then at him. The other instructors called that kind of thinking dangerous. For an empire that wants everyone to do exactly what they're told without question. Ethan said. "Yeah. It probably is." The next morning, Ethan asked to see where Nyria had failed her cultural ceremony examination, and was led, at her reluctant insistence, to the Eastern Tide Shrine, a modest coral structure overlooking the bay, where junior royals were traditionally required to perform the rite of first waters at age 12, an unremarkable ceremony that every Elisarian noble child completed without incident. Nyria had failed it twice. "Show me what you did wrong," Ethan said, and Nyria, jaw tight, walked him through the ritual, an offering of salt and kelp cast into the tide at the exact moment the third moon crested the horizon, accompanied by a spoken vow to the ocean that had, according to tradition, birthed the first Elisarian queen from its depths. "I asked the shrine keeper what would happen if the moon was obscured by cloud that night," Nyria said. "I asked because it seemed like an obvious problem. The timing is the entire point of the ceremony, and clouds aren't rare here. She told me the question itself was disrespectful. That the ritual doesn't need a contingency, because the ocean provides. I said the ocean doesn't provide anything, it's water, and asked what the actual backup plan was for royal children born in the rainy season. I failed for irreverence." "What's the actual answer?" Ethan asked. "Is there a backup?" "There's a backup," Nyria said bitterly. "There's always been a backup, a secondary ceremony performed at dawn instead, done privately, without ever being spoken of, because admitting the primary ritual has a contingency would apparently undercut the whole idea that the ocean itself chooses the moment. I only found out about the dawn ceremony because a laundry servant mentioned it in passing. Nobody had ever simply told me. I was failed for asking a question that had a perfectly good answer, because the answer itself was supposed to be a secret." Ethan sat with that for a long moment, looking out at the tide moving slow and gray beneath the shrine. "That's not a flaw in you," he said finally. "That's an institution more interested in preserving the appearance of certainty than in actually being honest about how it works. You didn't fail to understand the ritual. You understood it well enough to notice it had a seam nobody wanted acknowledged. That's what everything's been like," Nyria said quietly. "My whole life. Every time I found the seam, they told me the fabric didn't have one. Then let's start doing something different," Ethan said. "From now on, every time you find a seam, we're not going to pretend it isn't there. We're going to find out exactly why it exists, and whether it needs mending or replacing. Deal?" For the first time, Nyria didn't answer with wariness. She answered with something that, in a few more weeks, Ethan would come to recognize as the beginning of trust. "Deal," she said. The lessons that followed did not go smoothly, not at first, and not because Nyria was incapable. Ethan confirmed within the first week what he'd already suspected within the first hour. The problem had never been her intelligence. It was that Elisarian education, refined over 10,000 years, was built entirely around retention, the perfect, unquestioning recall of law, doctrine, and ceremony, and Nyria's mind simply didn't work that way. She didn't memorize information. She interrogated it. Every fact she was given, she immediately turned over, looking for the load-bearing logic underneath, and if she couldn't find it, she said so. To her instructors, this had looked like failure. To Ethan, who had spent 2 decades teaching exactly this kind of student, it looked like something else entirely. "You don't need to memorize the litany of succession," he told her, 3 weeks in, after she'd once again stumbled reciting the 7th verse. "You need to understand what each verse is for. Watch." He walked her through it verse by verse. Not as sacred text, but as history, explaining that the 3rd verse had been added 4,000 years ago specifically to prevent a civil war between rival heirs, that the 5th existed because an ancient queen had once tried to disinherit her daughter out of spite and the empire had nearly fractured over it. By the end of that session, Nyria recited the entire litany from memory without a single pause. Not because she drilled it, but because she finally understood the shape of it, the way you remember a story instead of a string of unconnected words. Vorenthes, who had begun quietly observing the lessons from the colonnade, ostensibly to monitor the humans' methods, though everyone including Ethan understood it was closer to surveillance, watched this particular session with visibly conflicting jaw patterns. "She has never recited it flawlessly before," he said afterward, cornering Ethan in the corridor. "In 19 years. She never needed to understand it before. Everyone kept telling her to just accept it. The litany is sacred text, Instructor Carter. It is not meant to be dissected like a war report. With respect," Ethan said, "everything is meant to be understood by the person who's going to be responsible for it. That's not disrespect. That's the job." Voren did not have an answer to that. Ethan noted, with some satisfaction, that this was becoming a pattern. Over the following weeks, the change in Nyria was not dramatic in the way a story might promise. There was no single triumphant morning where she awoke transformed. It was slower than that, and more real for being slow. She started arriving to lessons early instead of dreading them. She began interrupting Ethan mid-sentence with questions instead of waiting, silent and braced, to be told she was wrong. She laughed, genuinely, unguardedly, for the first time in longer than the palace staff could remember, when Ethan compared the entire structure of Elisarian naval hierarchy to a description of middle school cafeteria politics, and she'd laughed so hard she'd had to set down her tea. "You're ridiculous," she told him, wiping her eyes. "I've been told," Ethan said. "Usually by the same people who thought your naval doctrine needed updating." The palace staff noticed the change before the nobles did. A junior attendant named Faith, who had served the princess since childhood, mentioned to another servant that the princess had started humming while she dressed for council, something she hadn't done since she was small. A guard captain noted that Nyria walked differently now, shoulders back instead of braced inward, as though she'd stopped expecting to be struck. And in council, for weeks into Ethan's tenure, Nyria spoke for the first time in over a year without being directly addressed. The subject was trade tariffs on the floating market cities, dull, technical, the kind of debate that had once made Nyria stare silently at the table until it ended. This time, when the Minister of Commerce proposed raising tariffs on the outer causeway markets to fund coastal defense expansion, Nyria said, clearly and without hesitation, "That will bankrupt the fishing guilds within 2 seasons. You're solving a defense budget problem by breaking the economy that pays for it." The room went quiet. "Princess," the minister said carefully, "the defense budget shortfall is a matter of significance." "I'm not saying the shortfall isn't real," Nyria said. "I'm saying you're choosing the easiest place to take the money from, not the smartest one. There's an unused trade surplus tax sitting in the Treasury Reserve from the northern kelp exports that no one's touched in 6 years because it's politically inconvenient to reallocate. Move the money from there instead of from people who can't afford it." Queen Solane, seated at the head of the table, said nothing. But those close enough to see her face noted, with some astonishment, that for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the Queen looked at her eldest daughter with something other than weary concern. She looked, several ministers would later whisper, almost proud. Word spreads quickly in a palace built on gossip, and faster still through an empire that had spent 19 years quietly writing off its heir. Within 2 months, the whispers that had once been Nyria the Unready began, tentatively, to shift. "Did you hear she corrected the Treasury Minister's numbers?" In open council? They say she solved the kelp trade dispute the Southern Court has been arguing over for a decade, in one afternoon. My cousin serves in the War College. He says the strategy instructors are furious because her battlefield simulations keep outperforming the senior cadets. Not everyone was pleased. Nyria's younger sister, Illyra, 16, dutiful, and until recently the Empire's quiet favorite to inherit in Nyria's place, grew colder in the corridors, though she said nothing outright until the afternoon she cornered Ethan in the palace gardens, arms crossed, jaw patterns tight with something between anger and grief. Everyone keeps saying my sister was misunderstood, Illyra said without preamble. Do you know what that makes the rest of us look like? I spent 19 years being told I was the reliable one, the one who'd actually be ready, because Nyria couldn't manage a simple examination. Now suddenly she's brilliant, and I'm just the girl who memorized things well. You are the girl who memorized things well, Ethan said carefully. That's not nothing, Illyra. It's a real skill, and the Empire needs people who have it. But it's not what you're teaching her. No, Ethan admitted. Because she needed something different. That was never a judgment on what you're good at. It's just, not everyone's mind works the same way, and for a long time, this Empire only had one way of measuring whether a mind was working at all. Illyra was quiet for a moment, her jaw patterns dimming from anger into something more uncertain. I used to think I would be a better queen than her, she admitted. I still don't know if that's not true. I just know it isn't true for the reasons I always believed. That's a harder thing to sit with than being simply right or simply wrong, Ethan said. But it's usually closer to the truth than either. Illyra didn't answer that day, but she came back 3 more times over the following weeks, watching Nyria's lessons in silence from the colonnade, asking her own careful questions once the sting had faded enough to let her ask them honestly. It would be months before the two sisters spoke as easily as they once had, as small children before the weight of the succession had come between them, but Ethan noted, with some quiet satisfaction, that the ice had at least begun, slowly, to crack. Nobles who had built careers on the assumption of Nyria's incompetence found themselves suddenly, uncomfortably, reassessing their positions. And Vorinthes, who had spent 400 years believing he understood exactly what education was for, began attending every one of Ethan's lessons, ostensibly to observe, though his questions had grown noticeably less hostile and noticeably more curious. I do not understand what you are doing that we could not, he admitted to Ethan one evening, watching Nyria work through a treaty simulation with an ease that would have been unthinkable 4 months prior. Our instructors are vastly more learned than you. Some are older than your entire species' recorded history. You're not less smart than me, Ethan said. You just built an entire system around teaching people to accept answers instead of teaching them to ask questions. That works fine for a student whose mind is built for retention. It doesn't work for a student whose mind is built for interrogation. You spent 19 years grading her against a standard she was never going to fit, instead of noticing she'd built her own. Vorin was quiet for a long moment. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just not complicated in the way you've been treating it. Ethan glanced toward Nyria, still bent over her simulation, brow furrowed in the particular way she got when she'd found a flaw in the model and was chasing it down like a hound. She was never broken, headmaster. She was just being measured with the wrong instrument. It was around this time, 4 months into Ethan's tenure and with the coronation now barely 8 weeks away, that Queen Solane summoned him alone. The Queen's private study overlooked the western tide shrines, and Solane stood at the window with her back to him for a long moment before she spoke, which Ethan had learned by now was not a good sign among Elisarans. It meant she did not want him to see her jaw patterns while she said whatever she was about to say. You have done something in 4 months that 41 of the finest scholars in my empire could not do in 19 years, she said finally. I owe you honesty in return for that, Instructor Carter, even though I suspect you will not thank me for it. I'm listening. When I sent for you, I told myself, and told you, that I wanted Nyria educated. That was true. But it was not the whole truth. Solane finally turned. Her jaw patterns, Ethan had learned to read well enough by now, showed something he hadn't seen on her before: shame. The Academy of the Six Tides was never simply failing to teach my daughter. It was succeeding at something else entirely. Which was? Breaking her. The Queen's voice was very quiet. Instructor Carter, understand something about my empire. Elisara has been ruled by an unbroken line for 10,000 years, and it has survived that long in part because its rulers do not deviate. The doctrines, the ceremonies, the laws, they are maintained not merely because they are correct, but because an empire built on continuity cannot survive a ruler who continuously questions that continuity. My daughter was not failing her examinations because she lacked the capacity to pass them. She was failing them because passing them, as they are designed, requires obedience, and Nyria has never, since she was a small child, been capable of unquestioning obedience. The Academy did not fail to educate her. It succeeded, for 19 years, in trying to convince an entire empire, including Nyria herself, that her mind was a defect rather than a difference. Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. And you let that happen? I did. Solane did not flinch from the accusation, though it clearly cost her. Because I did not know how to stop it without endangering her further. A queen who questions doctrine is called visionary only after she succeeds, Instructor Carter. Before that, she is called a threat, by the War College, by the nobility, by every institution whose authority depends on the doctrine remaining unquestioned. I told myself that if she could simply learn to perform obedience, recite the doctrine correctly, pass the examinations as written, wear the mask long enough to secure the throne, she could change things safely, from within, once the crown was hers. I hired 41 instructors to help her wear that mask. Every one of them failed, because Nyria cannot lie convincingly, even to herself. And I hired you, hoping perhaps a mind unfamiliar with our doctrine entirely might succeed where our own scholars could not. Might finally teach her to hide what she is long enough to survive. The silence that followed was heavy enough that Ethan could hear the tide against the coral cliffs below. That's not what I've been doing, he said finally. I know. Something in the Queen's expression was almost like relief. I have watched you these past months, Instructor Carter, and I understand now that you were never teaching her to hide. You were teaching her to understand. Which is a far more dangerous gift than obedience, and also, I have come to believe, the only one that might actually save her. Save her from what, exactly? Solane's jaw patterns dimmed to something Ethan hadn't seen before: fear, plain and unguarded. The final examination for the throne, she said, is not, as it is presented to the public, a test of statecraft, history, and law. It is a political mechanism, Instructor Carter, refined over centuries by the War College and the Outer Court together, designed for exactly one purpose: to identify and eliminate heirs who think independently of doctrine before they can ever sit the throne and act on that independence. It is administered by the Council of Elders, and its questions are constructed, deliberately, precisely, to force a choice between two unacceptable answers. Recite the sanctioned doctrine and pass as an obedient future monarch, or answer honestly, reveal independent judgment, and be declared unfit to rule on grounds of instability. Ethan felt his stomach drop. That's not an examination. That's a trap. It is a trap that has never, in 600 years, failed to catch its intended target. Solane said quietly. Every heir in Elisaran history who showed signs of independent judgment before their coronation has either learned, in time, to hide it convincingly, or has been quietly declared unfit and replaced by a more compliant sibling. Nyria has never been able to hide it. Which is why the council has already begun, discreetly, preparing Illyra. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. You knew this when you hired me. I hoped you would teach her to survive it, the Queen said. I did not expect you to teach her to become someone who might actually deserve to end it. He didn't tell Nyria that night. He told himself it was because he needed time to think, but the truth, sitting alone on the balcony of his guest quarters with the tide sighing far below, was closer to fear, the specific, familiar fear of a man who has just realized that the person he's been teaching to think for herself is about to be judged, formally and finally, for exactly that. He thought of Marcus, back on Earth, who'd spent years being told he was unteachable before anyone bothered to ask why, and who'd gone on, eventually, to build things that mattered because someone had finally trusted him to think instead of merely comply. He thought of Claire, who used to say that the whole point of teaching wasn't to make children into what the system wanted. It was to make sure the system never got the chance to convince them they were broken before they found out what they were actually capable of. And he thought about the two paths in front of him now, laid out with an ugly clarity he wished he could unsee. He could spend the next 8 weeks teaching Nyria to pass the examination as it was designed to be passed. Coach her in the art of reciting sanctioned doctrine convincingly, teach her to bury the very quality that made her remarkable deep enough that the Council of Elders would see only a compliant future queen and wave her through. It would work. He was fairly certain of that now. Whatever else she was, Nyria was capable of near anything she set her mind to, including, if he taught her carefully enough, giving a very convincing performance of obedience. It would also mean undoing, deliberately, everything he had spent 4 months building. It would mean confirming, in the cruelest possible way, the lie the Academy had spent 19 years trying to teach her, that the thing she actually was needed to be hidden in order to be safe. Or he could teach her something else entirely. Not how to pass the trap. How to dismantle it. He didn't sleep that night. When morning came, he found Nyria in the sunlit study where he'd first met her, and for the first time since he'd arrived on Elisara, he told her everything. She took it better than he expected, and worse, in different ways. So it was never a real test, she said quietly, once he'd finished. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at her own hands, folded very still in her lap. 19 years of being told I was failing, and the whole system was built to make sure I failed. Not because I couldn't learn. Because I did learn, I just learned the wrong things, by their standards. I learned to ask why, instead of learning to just accept. Yeah. My mother let this happen. Your mother didn't build the trap, Ethan said carefully. She's spent 19 years trying to figure out how to get you through it without you being destroyed by it. I don't think that makes her innocent. I think it makes her scared, and I think she's been more scared of losing you than she's let either of us see. Nyria was quiet for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were dry, but something in her expression had hardened into a shape Ethan hadn't seen there before, not despair, and not the old guarded wariness either. Something closer to resolve. Teach me to beat it, she said. Whatever it takes. If they built an exam to catch heirs who think for themselves, then teach me how to think well enough that it can't catch me. That's what I'm planning to do, Ethan said. But I want you to understand what that actually means, before you commit to it. I'm not going to teach you to hide what you are long enough to slip past them. I don't think that would even work. You've never been able to fake obedience convincingly, and honestly, I don't want to teach you how. What I can teach you is how to answer their questions honestly, in a way that makes your judgment impossible to dismiss as instability. Not by hiding the fact that you think differently. By making the case, clearly enough and well enough, that thinking differently is exactly what this empire needs in its next ruler. They built the exam to eliminate exactly that kind of answer. They built it to eliminate heirs who couldn't defend that kind of answer. Ethan said. Every trap has an assumption baked into it. This one assumes that anyone who deviates from doctrine is doing it out of ignorance or instability, because that's the only kind of deviation the Council has ever seen before you. You're going to give them something they've never actually had to grade, someone who understands the doctrine completely, agrees with most of it, and can explain, precisely, calmly, and correctly, exactly why the parts she disagrees with need to change, and what should replace them. That's not instability, Nyria. That's the single most dangerous thing you can hand a room full of people whose entire authority depends on nobody ever making that case competently before. Nyria studied him for a long moment. You really think that's possible? In 8 weeks? I think you've already done harder things in the last 4 months. Ethan said. I just didn't tell you that's what we were building toward. Now I am. For the first time since he told her the truth, Nyria smiled. Small, and sharp, and entirely her own. Then we'd better get started. What followed was not, Ethan would later reflect, so different from what he'd already been doing, except that now, both of them knew exactly what it was for. They went through the 60-year doctrine again, this time not merely to understand its history, but to identify precisely which elements remained sound and which had genuinely calcified into liability. And crucially, to build the argument for each proposed change so thoroughly that no examiner could dismiss it as youthful impatience rather than considered judgment. They went through the litany of succession, the trade law, the religious calendar, the entire architecture of Elysaran governance, verse by clause by precedent, until Nyria could not only recite each piece flawlessly, but explain, for every single one, the specific historical problem it had been built to solve. And whether that problem still existed in its original form. The point, Ethan told her, again and again, isn't to prove the old system is wrong. Most of it isn't. The point is to prove you can tell the difference between tradition that's still load-bearing and tradition that's just been mistaken for load-bearing because nobody's tested it in 600 years. That distinction is the entire argument. Memorize it like your life depends on it. Because it does. Vorenthess, who by now had become something closer to a genuine ally than a skeptical observer, brought his own contribution, 400 years of institutional memory about exactly how the Council of Elders had historically phrased its trap questions, and precisely which answers, across 6 centuries of records, had been used to justify declaring an heir unfit. They will not ask her outright whether she intends to change the doctrine, he told Ethan grimly, laying out century-old transcripts across the study table. That would be too obvious. They will ask her to apply it, to a scenario constructed specifically so that the doctrinally correct answer produces an outcome any competent ruler would recognize as disastrous. The trap is that the doctrinally correct answer and the demonstrably correct answer are made to look identical to anyone who has not thought deeply enough to see the difference. She will be tested on whether she notices the gap, and then, having noticed it, whether she has the composure and the argument to say so plainly, to the council's faces, without hedging. That's exactly what she's been doing all her life. Ethan said. We're not teaching her a new skill. We're just making sure she's fast enough, and calm enough, and armed with enough precedent, to do it under the worst possible pressure, in front of the people who've spent 19 years hoping she'd fail. Nyria, listening from across the room, said nothing, but the set of her jaw, when Ethan glanced at her, had the particular stillness of someone gathering their resolve rather than losing it. Queen Solane, informed at last of the plan by both Ethan and Voren together, did not forbid it, though her jaw patterns betrayed real fear when she heard it laid out in full. If the council perceives this as a direct challenge to the elders' authority, she said, they may simply refuse to certify her regardless of how well she argues. There is precedent for that, too. There's also no precedent, Voren said quietly, for a council refusing to certify an heir who has just, in open examination, publicly and correctly identified a flaw in doctrine that every elder in the room privately knows exists but has been too afraid to say aloud. They can silence an heir who is merely rebellious. It is far harder for them to silence one who is right, in front of witnesses, using the elders' own precedents against them. There were nights, in those 8 weeks, when the weight of it nearly broke her, not the material itself, which she mastered with a speed that left even Voren quietly astonished, but the knowledge of exactly what failure would cost. Ethan found her once, well past midnight, sitting alone in the dark of the study with an unlit lamp beside her, staring at nothing. Talk to me, he said, pulling up the chair across from her, the same one he'd sat in uninvited on the very first day. What if I'm wrong? She asked, and for a moment she sounded less like a future queen than like exactly what she was, a 19-year-old girl about to be judged, in public, by everyone who had ever doubted her. What if the doctrine really is sacred, and I'm just too arrogant to see it, and everyone who called me unready was right all along? Then you'll have been wrong honestly, Ethan said, which is a very different thing than being wrong the way they always assumed you were. But I don't think that's what's actually keeping you up tonight. I think you're scared that being right won't be enough. That they'll find some other reason to say no, because the real reason was never about doctrine at all. Nyria didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was smaller than he'd heard it in weeks. My whole life, I'd been told the problem was me. That if I could just learn to be different, quieter, more obedient, less myself, everything would be fine. Some nights I still believe them. It would be so much easier to believe them. I know, Ethan said. I had a year like that, after Claire died. Easier to believe I'd done something wrong, some way I could have caught it sooner, than to accept that sometimes the world is just cruel for no reason you can fix by being different. It took me a long time to learn the difference between a problem that's actually yours to solve, and a problem that was never yours in the first place. It just got handed to you by people who didn't want to carry it themselves. He met her eyes. This was never your problem to fix by becoming smaller, Nyria. It was the Empire's problem, for building a system too rigid to recognize what it had. You're not walking into that hall to prove you can shrink to fit it. You're walking in to prove the hall needs to grow. Nyria was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she reached over and lit the lamp herself. Ask me the aerial incursion scenario again, she said. I want to run it once more before I sleep. They ran it 4 more times before dawn. By the 4th, her answer had lost every trace of hesitation. The Queen was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time in longer than the palace staff could recall, she reached out and rested a hand briefly on her eldest daughter's shoulder. Then let us make certain she is right, she said, and let us make certain everyone sees it. Not everyone in Threnhollow wanted Nyria to succeed, and as the weeks narrowed toward the coronation, those interests stopped operating quietly. It began with a letter, and signed, delivered to the outer court steward, questioning whether it was appropriate for a foreign national with no formal credentials, no understanding of Elissaran law, and no accountability to the crown's institutions, to be shaping the education of a future monarch so close to her ascension. It was, on its surface, a reasonable question. It was also, Vorin recognized immediately, the opening move of a coordinated effort. There will be more of these, he warned Ethan, showing him the letter over morning-tide tea in the Academy's East Tower. Lord Cashenthal has led the War College faction for 30 years. He was among the loudest voices insisting the princess be quietly passed over for Illyra. Your success has cost him a great deal of certainty, and men like Cashenthal do not surrender certainty gracefully. The second move came a week later, when a formal petition circulated among the outer court demanding Ethan's diplomatic credentials be reviewed by the War College before the coronation examination, a transparent delay tactic, timed precisely to eat into the 8 weeks of preparation remaining. Queen Solane quashed the petition within a day, invoking her authority as reigning monarch, but the message underneath it was unmistakable. The outer court intended to make this as difficult as institutional maneuvering allowed. The third move was aimed not at Ethan, but at Nyria directly. Lord Cashenthal requested, and by ancient custom, was owed, a private audience with the heir apparent before her examination, ostensibly to offer counsel befitting his station. Ethan was not permitted to attend. Nyria went alone, and returned an hour later with her jaw set in a way Ethan had learned to recognize as fury held very carefully in check. He didn't threaten me outright, she told Ethan afterward, pacing the length of the study. He's too careful for that. He simply reminded me, at length, how many heirs across Elissaran history have been quietly set aside for the good of the realm when their judgment was found wanting. He reminded me that Illyra is well liked, well prepared, and, his word, steady. He wanted me to understand, without ever saying it plainly, that failing this examination would not simply cost me the throne. It would confirm, publicly and permanently, everything they've said about me since I was 6 years old. Is that going to change what we've built? Nyria stopped pacing and looked at him. Really looked, the way she'd learned to over these months, weighing a question rather than reacting to it. No, she said finally. But it clarified something for me. Kashanthal isn't afraid I'll fail the examination. He's afraid I'll pass it. If I fail, I confirm what he's always said about me. If I pass, honestly, on my own terms, the way you're teaching me to, I prove that everything the War College has protected for 600 years was never as untouchable as they've claimed. That's the actual threat. Not my judgment. What my judgment proves is possible. Then let's make sure it's not just possible, Ethan said. Let's make sure it's undeniable. Voren, for his part, weathered his own quiet consequences for his growing alliance with the human tutor. A formal reprimand from the War College for irregular conduct unbecoming the Academy's neutrality. A threat to his pension that he waved off with 400 years of accumulated indifference to threats of exactly that kind. I have spent 4 centuries teaching students to recite what they were told without asking whether it was true, he told Ethan one evening, not long before the examination, with something in his voice that sounded almost like grief. I do not know how many minds like hers I failed to notice, across 400 years, because I was never taught to look for them. I am too old to undo that. But I am not too old to make certain it does not happen again. The Hall of Elders had not hosted a coronation examination witnessed by the full court in over a century. Traditionally, the exam was conducted privately, its verdict announced rather than observed, a fact that had always struck Ethan as suspicious in exactly the way it now proved to be. But Queen Solane, in one of the few interventions she permitted herself, invoked an ancient and rarely used clause allowing the reigning monarch to request the examination be held in open court. For the transparency and confidence of the realm. The Council of Elders, unable to refuse the sitting queen without appearing to fear scrutiny, agreed, with visible reluctance. The hall was full when Nyria entered, nobles, ministers, the War College's senior strategists, Voranthes seated near the front with an expression carved from stone, Illyra watching from the royal gallery with an unreadable face, and Ethan himself, granted a seat at the rear as a foreign observer, close enough to see, and too far to help. The Elder's scenario, when it came, was exactly the kind of trap Voren had predicted, a hypothetical border incursion along the northern causeway cities, requiring the princess to apply the 60-year doctrine's coastal defense formation to repel an approaching cryo force. Describe the correct deployment, Your Highness, intoned the eldest of the elders, a vast, ancient Elisarian named Corey Van Rel, whose bioluminescent patterns had faded to a dim, unreadable gray with age. As prescribed by doctrine. Nyria did not hesitate. The doctrine prescribes a triple-line naval formation anchored at the causeway pylons, drawing the bulk of coastal defense forces into a static defensive perimeter designed to repel amphibious assault, she said clearly, calmly, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. I can recite the formation exactly, including the historical context in which it was developed. Following the second Cryal incursion, 612 years ago, when Elder Thessikvan first identified that Elisara's coastal cities were vulnerable specifically to slow, large-scale amphibious landings, and designed the triple-line formation to concentrate naval strength precisely where such landings would occur. Then you understand the doctrine, Elder Rel said, and something in his tone suggested he expected the recitation to stop there, satisfied. I understand it completely, Nyria said. Which is precisely why I would not apply it to the scenario as described. A murmur moved through the hall. Ethan, watching from the back, saw Voren's shoulders straighten almost imperceptibly. Explain, said Elder Rel, and for the first time, something sharp entered his ancient, dimmed patterns. The scenario specifies the cryo force is approaching with aerial support, Nyria said. The triple-line naval formation was designed to counter amphibious landing craft, surface vessels, slow-moving, easily concentrated against. It has no provision whatsoever for aerial threat, because 612 years ago, the cryo possessed no aircraft. Applying the doctrine exactly as written in this scenario would mean concentrating our entire naval defense along static coastal lines while an aerial force bypasses them entirely and strikes the causeway cities from above, undefended. Following the doctrine precisely, in this specific scenario, would not protect Elisara. It would guarantee its defeat. The hall had gone entirely silent now. Elder Rel's patterns had stilled into something unreadable. "You would disregard 600 years of established doctrine," he said slowly, "on the judgment of a 19-year-old who has never commanded a single soldier in the field." "I would not disregard it," Nyria said. "I would honor what it actually represents, rather than the letter of what it says." Elder Thessikvan did not write the triple-line formation because static naval defense is inherently sacred. He wrote it because it was the correct solution to the threat his empire actually faced. If Elder Van himself stood in this hall today, examining a scenario involving an aerial incursion his doctrine never anticipated, I do not believe he would insist his 600-year-old formation be applied exactly as written regardless of the cost. I believe he would ask precisely the question I am asking now: what does this threat actually require? And I'd believe the answer, honestly given, would look considerably different from a doctrine built for a different century's war. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had not wavered once. "I would deploy a dispersed defense. Mobile anti-aircraft batteries drawn from the reserve garrison at Havenreach, concentrated air denial coverage over the causeway approach, and a reduced naval presence held in reserve rather than committed to a static line, ready to respond wherever the actual threat materializes rather than where 600-year-old doctrine assumes it will." I can cite the precedent for this adaptation in the writings of Elder Van himself, in the addendum he wrote 9 years after the original doctrine, in which he explicitly states that the formation should be revised the moment Elisara's enemies change their method of attack. That addendum exists in the Academy archive. It has not, to my knowledge, been read aloud in this hall in over 500 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Elder Rel sat very still for a long moment, his ancient jaw patterns flickering through something that might have been anger, and might, Ethan thought, watching closely from the back of the hall, have been something closer to recognition. "You are suggesting," the elder said finally, "that this council has, for centuries, enforced a doctrine more rigidly than its own author intended." "I am suggesting," Nyria said, "that an empire which survives 10,000 years does so not because its traditions never change, but because it has, at every crisis point in its history, produced rulers capable of telling the difference between the tradition that is still protecting its people, and the tradition that has simply been mistaken for protection because no one dared to look closely enough to check. I do not intend to discard 600 years of doctrine, Elder Rel. I intend to honor it the way its own author asked us to, by testing it against the world we actually face, rather than the world it was written for." Elder Rel did not respond immediately. Beside him, a second elder, a smaller, sharper-featured Elisaran named Ithraves, whose bioluminescent patterns had remained a hard, skeptical amber throughout the entire exchange, leaned forward. "A pleasing performance, Your Highness," Ithra said, and there was an edge to her voice that had not been present in Elder Rel's questioning. "But defense doctrine is not the whole of statecraft, nor even the greater part of it. Let us test whether your willingness to revise extends only to matters where revision is convenient." The rite of first tide, performed at every coronation for 10,000 years without interruption, requires the sovereign to fast for 3 days and stand vigil at the western shrine until the tide itself turns. Many among the outer court have quietly questioned, in recent generations, whether this custom serves any purpose beyond ceremony and ought to be abolished as needless hardship upon an already burdened new monarch. Tell this council plainly, will you keep the rite, or discard it? Ethan, from the back of the hall, felt his chest tighten. It was, he recognized immediately, a different trap than the first, not testing whether Nyria could identify a doctrine that needed to change, but whether she would default to changing things simply because change had become, in this hall today, the position that had won her favor. A princess who had just triumphed by revising doctrine might easily be tempted to prove her independence again, reflexively, on a matter where independence was not actually warranted. It was a subtler snare, and a more dangerous one, because the correct answer required Nyria to argue against the very impulse that had carried her this far. Nyria did not answer quickly. She took a moment, visibly, deliberately. Before she spoke, and Ethan understood she was doing exactly what he had spent 8 weeks teaching her to do, separating the question of whether a tradition was old from the question of whether it was still doing its work. "I will keep the right," she said finally. "And I will keep it in its entirety, without alteration." A ripple of surprise moved through the hall. Plainly, this was not the answer many had expected from the same princess who had just dismantled 6 centuries of naval doctrine in the same sitting. "Explain your reasoning," Ithra said, "given how readily you revised the doctrine only moments ago." "The 60-year doctrine is a technical instrument," Nyria said. "It exists to solve a specific external problem, repelling a specific kind of threat. And when the threat changes, the instrument must change with it, or it fails at the only job it was ever built to do. The right of first tide is not a technical instrument. It asks nothing of the tide, and nothing of the enemy. It asks something of the sovereign herself, that she stand alone, without comfort, and prove to herself and to her people that she can endure hardship before she is permitted to ask hardship of anyone else. That purpose has not changed in 10,000 years, because the nature of what it means to lead has not changed in 10,000 years. I do not revise a tradition because it is difficult. I revise it only when the world it was built to answer has moved out from under it, and the world has not moved out from under this one. The fast and the vigil are not needless hardship, Elder Vess. They are the only part of the coronation that asks the sovereign to prove something to herself, rather than to everyone watching her. I would think an empire that has just watched me argue for careful judgment over reflexive obedience would recognize that the same judgment, applied honestly, sometimes says keep, and not merely change. Elder Ithra Vess sat back slowly, her sharp amber patterns dimming by degrees into something considerably less hostile. She said nothing further, but she did not need to. The point, plainly, had landed with more force for having been unexpected. Elder Rel exchanged a long look with his fellow elders along the great bench, a silent conference conducted entirely in the shifting language of jaw patterns that Ethan, even after 5 months on Elisara, still could not fully read. Then, without further comment, the council rose as one and withdrew behind the great sealed doors of the inner chamber to deliberate. The council deliberated for 3 hours behind closed doors, and the hall, in that time, did not empty. Nobles and ministers and soldiers stayed in their seats, murmuring, watching the great sealed doors as though the fate of the empire itself were behind them, which, in a very real sense, it was. Ethan found Nyria in the antechamber where she waited, alone, her composure from the hall finally cracking at the edges now that the room had emptied of witnesses. "Did I go too far?" she asked quietly, the first genuine uncertainty he'd heard from her in weeks. "You told the truth as clearly and carefully as anyone could have told it," Ethan said. "I don't know what they'll decide. Nobody does yet, not even them, probably. But you didn't hide, and you didn't lie, and you didn't let them make you smaller than you are just because it would have been safer. Whatever happens next, that part was never in question. You did it right. That's not the same as winning." "No," Ethan agreed. "But it's the only version of winning that would have actually been worth having." When the doors finally opened, Elder Rel himself emerged to deliver the verdict, an honor, Vorin murmured afterward, that had not been extended to any heir in living memory, as the verdict was traditionally announced by a junior clerk. "The Council of Elders," Rel said, his voice carrying through the reassembled hall, "finds that Princess Nyria has demonstrated not merely comprehensive knowledge of Elisaran doctrine, but a rare and specific mastery, the ability to distinguish between the letter of tradition and its living purpose, and the judgment to know when honoring the second requires revising the first. This council has, for 6 centuries, treated deviation from established doctrine as evidence of unfitness. We are compelled, today, to reconsider that assumption, not because tradition no longer matters, but because we have this day witnessed an heir who understands it more completely, and honors it more faithfully, than this council itself has in generations. He paused, and for the first time in the entire proceeding, something that might almost have been respect crossed his ancient features. Princess Nyria is certified fit to inherit the ocean throne. And this council recommends, further, that the addendum of Elder Thess Van, unread in this hall for 5 centuries, be restored to formal doctrine, and that the examination process itself be reviewed, in light of what today has revealed about its design. The hall erupted. Ethan, watching from the back, saw Voranthes close his eyes briefly, his jaw patterns pulsing with an emotion 400 years of restraint had clearly not prepared him to display in public. He saw Queen Solane, seated at the head of the court, allow herself, for one unguarded moment, to simply weep. And he saw Nyria, the greatest embarrassment in royal history, the girl 41 instructors had declared unteachable, standing very still in the center of the hall, looking not triumphant, exactly, but something steadier than that. Something that looked, for the first time in 19 years, like a person who had finally been seen. Ethan stayed on Elisara for another year, at Nyria's request and eventually, at Queen Solane's formal invitation, not as her personal tutor any longer, but as an advisor to the newly reformed Academy of the Six Tides, where Voranthes, in what the outer court considered the most radical development in the institution's history, had begun quietly restructuring the entire curriculum around the principle that understanding why a rule existed mattered more than reciting that it did. Nyria's coronation, when it came, was unlike any in Elisaran memory, not because the ceremony itself changed, but because the new queen, in her first formal address, spent as much time discussing which doctrines she intended to preserve, and why, as she did discussing which she intended to revise. The 60-year doctrine was quietly amended within her first season on the throne, incorporating Elder Van's long-buried addendum. The examination process for future heirs was overhauled entirely, no longer designed to catch independent thought, but to test for it. Illyra, to everyone's quiet relief, did not resent her sister for long. She had watched the examination too, from the royal gallery, and had come away from it with a question of her own, one she brought to Ethan not long after. Could someone teach me to think that way too, even if I'm never going to be queen? Ethan said yes. It was, after all, the only answer he'd ever really known how to give. As for Ethan himself, he returned to the Corvallis relay eventually, because it was still home, in the quiet way a place becomes home after enough years of grief have settled into something more like peace. But he returned changed, in a way he hadn't expected an alien princess to change him. He'd spent 6 years since Claire's death believing his best work was behind him. That he was simply marking time until the end of a career he'd once loved. Nyria had reminded him, without ever meaning to, that the work he did, noticing the students everyone else had given up on, and teaching them not what to think but how, mattered exactly as much on a remote space station as it did on an ocean planet 10,000 years into an unbroken dynasty. He kept, framed on his desk, a small carved tight shrine token Nyria had given him on his last day at Threnhollow. A traditional Elisaran gift, she'd explained, given to someone who had fundamentally changed the course of another person's life. They're usually given to war heroes, she told him, pressing it into his hands. Or to the authors of doctrines that survive 1,000 years. I'm either of those things, Ethan had said. No, Nyria had agreed, smiling in the sharp, unguarded way that had become entirely her own. You're the first person who ever looked at me and asked why, instead of simply telling me I was wrong. As far as I'm concerned, that makes you more important than either. Years later, Elisaran historians would write of Queen Nyria's reign as the beginning of what they came to call the Age of the Living Doctrine. The first era in the Empire's 10,000-year history in which tradition was treated not as a wall to be defended, but as a living argument, continuously tested against the world it was meant to protect. They would write, too, of the human schoolteacher who had first noticed what an empire of scholars had missed for 19 years. That the greatest embarrassment in royal history had never been broken at all. She had simply been the first one brave enough to ask why.